The cold was a viscous thing, clinging to the inside of my lungs and refusing to be exhaled fully. It was the deep, unrelenting cold of early November in the High Sierra, the kind that promised snow but delivered only an oppressive, crystal-clear atmosphere that made the distant peaks look deceptively close and entirely unforgiving. 3 days. 72 hours since 8-year-old Toby Matthews had vanished from the fringe of the Blackwood Preserve, swallowed whole by the dense tapestry of fir and rock we called a national park. My name is Elias Vance. I've been a ranger here for 15 years, long enough to see the changing seasons carve new faces into the mountains, and long enough to understand that when the woods decide they are done with you, they don't leave crumbs. They leave silence. And silence in the Blackwood is always the prelude to heartbreak. The official search had scaled back drastically by the time I descended into Lake Seraph. The helicopters had retreated, their churning rotors replaced by the muffled, rhythmic sloshing of the water against the hull of the small aluminum dive platform. Command had moved into the recovery phase, a cold, clinical euphemism for admitting defeat. They were looking for a body now, not a boy. Lake Seraph was our last, worst hope. It wasn't large, but it was notoriously deep, fed by ancient subterranean thermal vents that kept the surface from freezing solid until midwinter, creating a perpetual chilling fog that hugged the perimeter like a shroud. Locals, the ones who lived nestled against the park boundary and saw things the tourists never did, had their own names for Seraph. They called it the Eye of the Woods, claiming it looked upward and saw everything, but never let go of anything it claimed. It had been scanned superficially, of course, but the sonar was useless past 40 feet, due to the density of glacial silt and some bizarre mineral composition in the water that scrambled the acoustic signatures. A manual eyeball search was the only option left. I sat on the edge of the platform, the 70 pounds of dry suit, tanks and gear settling around me like a second protective skin. My partner Mark was tending the lines, his face a mask of bone-deep resignation beneath the brim of his wool hat. He didn't look at me. Neither of us needed to speak the implied mandate. Find something conclusive so the family can grieve and the press can move on. Depth estimate is 80 feet at the south basin where the current pushes. Mark's voice crackled through the comms built into my full-face mask, his tone professional and flat. Visibility is going to be nil after 30. Stick to the grid, 5-meter sweeps. Understood, I replied. The sound of my own breath amplified and hollow inside the helmet. I felt the familiar, heavy resignation of slipping into the unknown, a process I'd executed hundreds of times for lost hikers, crashed planes or drowned wildlife. I rolled backward off the platform. The initial plunge was a shock, even through the insulated suit. The upper layers of the lake were merely freezing, the lower layers promised true hypothermia. I sank slowly, venting air from my buoyancy compensator, watching the world transition from the hazy grey light above to the absolute suffocating darkness below. The first 50 feet were characterized by a dull, olive-green soup, punctuated by the occasional skeletal remains of submerged pine trees, spectral forests reaching up, clawing at the light they would never touch. At 60 feet, the light vanished entirely. It wasn't the natural darkness of night, it was the heavy, aqueous blackness of the abyss, where light simply doesn't exist, absorbed by the sheer volume of water and microscopic particulates. I switched on my powerful wrist-mounted LED torch. It did little more than illuminate the silt directly in front of my mask, carving out a pathetic, narrow cone of visibility in the overwhelming void. I was searching blindly, navigating solely by the tautness of the safety line anchored to the platform and the precise cadence of my own fin kicks. The silence here was different from the silence above. Above, silence was the absence of sound. Down here, silence was the presence of pressure, a muffled, crushing weight that devoured all external noise, leaving only the mechanical hiss of my regulator and the drumming of my own heart against my ribs. I reached the bottom at 82 feet. The ground was not rock or hard earth, but a strange, ancient sediment, fine grey silt that had been accumulating for millennia. It disturbed easily, blooming into clouds of fine dust with every careless movement of my fins, further reducing visibility to zero. I had to move like a ghost, hovering just inches above the floor, sweeping the powerful beam of my torch in slow, deliberate arcs, looking for anything that wasn't mud or fossilized decay. The routine was torturous. Move forward 3 kicks. Stop. Sweep the light left, right, down. Advance the line 5 meters. Repeat. The minutes stretched into an endless, oxygen-depleting crawl. My mind drifted into the monotonous rhythm, seeking refuge from the horrifying image I expected to encounter. A small, brightly colored jacket, perhaps a sneaker or worse. The search for human remains in water is always a grim calculus of time and decomposition, and after 3 days in water this cold, the results would be terrible. Half an hour passed, then 45 minutes. My gauge warned me I was approaching the turnaround point. We'd covered less than 10% of the assigned zone. Mark was right, this was impossible. We were just checking boxes for the state police. I was about to signal my ascent when my beam caught a subtle interruption in the smooth sedimentary landscape. It wasn't large. It was a shape, barely distinguishable from the surrounding environment, half buried in the silt. My heart immediately lurched, sending a surge of adrenaline through the icy numbness of my body. I carefully propelled myself toward it, keeping my fins high, avoiding kicking up the obscuring mud. I extended my gloved hand. The object wasn't soft, which was a relief and also immediately confusing. It was angular, structured. I gripped it, pulling it free from the suction of the lake bed. It was a backpack. It was small, red and blue synthetic fabric. The kind of inexpensive, brightly colored pack designed to carry maybe a lunchbox and a couple of schoolbooks. Toby's parents had described it in detail. Captain Comet motif, a slightly frayed strap where he always grabbed it. This was it. I secured the pack to my safety line with a practiced knot, signaling Mark with 3 sharp tugs on the line that I had found something. Mark's voice immediately burst into the comms, laced with suppressed tension. "Elias, what is it? Confirm." "It's the pack, Mark. Toby's," I whispered, the word thick with the metallic taste of relief and dread. Relief that the search had closure. Dread because the boy wasn't in it. The ascent was faster, driven by the urgency of the discovery. I watched the blackness slowly yield to the bruised grey light near the surface. When I breached the water, gasping the cold mountain air, the pack was immediately lifted from my grasp by Mark and another ranger who had just arrived. They placed it on the platform, dripping and dark, a sodden, heavy monument to loss. The fabric was saturated, matte with clinging mud and lake particulates. It looked exactly like something that had spent close to 80 hours submerged in 80 feet of water. Mark crouched over it, his gloved fingers tracing the outline of the zipper. "Elias, look," he said, his voice unusually strained. "The seals, they look intact. The pockets are zipped up tight." We understood the implications. If the pack was zipped, the contents were sealed inside, preserved in their current state of decomposition. The police technician, a young woman named Harper, who specialized in aquatic evidence, moved quickly, pulling on thin nitrile gloves over her heavier work gloves. "We need to open it carefully. Try to preserve any trace evidence," she instructed, taking a deep breath. We cut the main zipper open with extreme caution. The teeth grumbled as they separated, shedding fine streams of lake water onto the aluminum deck. The moment the main compartment was revealed, the surrounding noise, the distant chatter of the staging area, the lapping of the water, seemed to fall away. There was no immediate rush of water draining out. This was the first anomaly. A pack this size, submerged that long, should be a waterlogged sponge. Harper reached inside with a forensic light and a pair of long tweezers. She drew out a small plastic sandwich bag. It was Toby's lunch, precisely as his mother had packed it. A half-eaten peanut butter sandwich, slightly squashed, and a small, perfectly dry apple. The sandwich was not dissolved or moldy. It looked like it had been sitting on a countertop for 3 days, slightly stale, yes, but fundamentally preserved. My breath caught in my throat. I peeled off my diving mask, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. "Mark, the pack. How heavy was it when I signaled the line?" "Heavy, Elias. Felt like it was full of rocks or mud." "Why?" I stared at the apple and the sandwich, then down into the opened maw of the backpack. The inner lining was a synthetic, bright orange nylon. It should have been dark with moisture, clinging and cold. Harper, her face pale, probed deeper. She pulled out a small sketch pad. The paper should have dissolved into pulp, the graphite smeared beyond recognition. Instead, the edges were crisp. The cover was wet, yes, slick with lake grime, but when she gently pulled back the cover, the inner pages were completely dry. "This is impossible," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "The outside is saturated, the stitching is waterlogged, but the contents—" The impossible discovery wasn't the pack itself. It was the interior. It was bone dry. The synthetic material of the interior compartment was unnaturally stiff. It felt like it had been left to dry in the sun for a week. I knelt closer, ignoring the water dripping off my suit. The smell that emanated from the backpack wasn't the expected stench of anaerobic decay, stagnant water, and deep lake sediment. It was a faint, almost metallic scent, overlaid with something else, the clean, sharp smell of new crayons and the distinctive, slightly sugary aroma of children's bubble gum. Harper carefully reached to the very bottom of the backpack. Her hand stopped, and she frowned. She reached in again and pulled out the source of the subtle, sugary scent. It was a small, green plastic box of wax crayons. I looked at the outside of the box. It was slimy, covered in a thin, iridescent film of deep lake biological matter. It was undeniably wet. Yet, when she flipped the lid open, it was a simple cardboard hinge. The crayons inside were perfectly intact. The paper wrappings were bright green, blue, and yellow. More importantly, the bottom of the box, which sat flush against the nylon lining of the pack, was totally, unequivocally dry. It was the ultimate pattern interrupt. 82 feet of water pressure, days of saturation, and yet the air pocket, if that's what it was, had held. But how? The pack was not a specialized waterproof container. It was cheap nylon with standard zippers that had demonstrably allowed the outside to saturate, but somehow prevented any moisture from passing beyond a certain point inside the main compartment. "Elias," Mark said, his voice a tight rope of disbelief. "If this was sealed perfectly, why does the outside feel like heavy wet carpet? Why is the webbing soaked?" I shook my head, my mind racing through every known law of hydrodynamics and material science. There was no rational explanation for an ordinary child's backpack to be submerged for 3 days and possess a dry interior compartment. Zero. None. I looked down at the bright, innocent green crayon box sitting on the deck, dripping Lake Seraph's ancient, murky water onto the clean, dry wax inside. The silt-stained exterior of the pack now felt less like a tragic piece of evidence and more like a bizarre shell concealing an impossible void. "Harper, catalog everything," I ordered, my voice rough. "Photograph the interior lining before you remove another piece. We need to document the state of that fabric." "But the trace evidence," she started. "Forget the trace evidence for a minute," I cut her off. "The anomaly is the evidence. This changes everything. Whatever found Toby's pack, whatever sealed it, it didn't just preserve the contents, it preserved them against the laws of nature." I knelt closer to the pack, touching the lining. It was warm. Not aggressively hot, but distinctly above ambient temperature, a faint, almost electrical warmth emanating from the orange nylon. We had found Toby's pack at the bottom of the darkest part of the lake, in a place notorious for taking things. It was a grim find, yes, closure for the family, but the dry bottom of that pack wasn't closure. It was a door, sealed tight against the surrounding world, and now that we had forced it open, I felt a deep, sickening certainty. We weren't looking for a missing child anymore. We were looking for what happened to a child who crossed into something completely unknown, and this dry, warm piece of nylon was its calling card. My eyes scanned the contents one last time: the dry sandwich, the clean pages, the unscented crayon box. This object should have been heavy with water. Instead, it felt heavy with implication. The impossible, the inexplicable, had just surfaced, dripping lake water onto our rational world, and I knew, with the cold certainty of a ranger who has seen too much, that the official report would never mention the dryness. They couldn't. This was the moment the search for Toby Matthews officially ceased to be a rescue mission and became something else entirely, something terrifyingly silent. I need to know what kept that moisture out, what mechanism, natural or otherwise, could defy the crushing weight of the Blackwood Preserve's own deep lake. Join me in the next segment as we dive deeper into the forensic analysis of the dry backpack contents and discover the hidden layer beneath the pristine sketchpad drawing. I should have brought the backpack directly to command. I know that. Every rule in the Ranger Handbook, every protocol hammered into me during training screamed for immediate notification. But the sheer impossibility of the situation had locked my mouth shut, turning me into a thief of evidence, a conspirator in an ongoing disappearance. The secrecy wasn't about protecting the investigation. It was about protecting my own sanity from external dismissal. The drying process continued, or rather the lack of a drying process. The backpack, resting on the steel table in my isolated workshop, a converted shed miles from the main station, was still emitting a faint, earthy smell, but it was structurally perfect. I had spent the last 72 hours meticulously cataloguing its components. The official report stated Leo had been missing for over 6 months, exposed to the elements, likely carried away by swift currents and submerged. Yet the interior lining of the bag showed no desiccation, no hydrostatic compression damage, no mold spores whatsoever. The key was the focus of my deepening dread. I had placed it under the microscope, an old geological unit I used for rock analysis. It was heavy, disproportionately dense for its size, an alloy I couldn't identify. It was dark, almost black, with intricate angular grooves that looked less like a traditional lock key and more like a calibration tool or an interface element. The true horror lay in the residue, a microscopic shimmering dust clinging to its teeth. When I exposed this dust to UV light, it didn't fluoresce. It absorbed the light, leaving a perfect light-starved silhouette against the purple glow, an absence of luminescence that felt fundamentally wrong. I scraped a minuscule amount and sent it discreetly through an old contact at a university lab miles away, listing the sample vaguely as ancient mining debris. The waiting compounded the paranoia. I couldn't shake the image of the lake bottom. Lake Serafina was a deep-water glacial tarn known for its abyssal silt and near-freezing temperatures below 30 feet. When I pulled the bag up, and I remembered the specific gravity of the haul, the way the line went taut then suddenly eased, it should have been coated in a viscous layer of fine grey mud infused with the organic decay of centuries. But the spot was clean. The base layer where the backpack had rested wasn't silt. It was too smooth, too hard. In the brief, panicked moments of retrieving the bag, I hadn't given it a proper examination, but the memory was now a burning certainty. The bottom felt like polished stone, maybe concrete, impossibly flat. I had to go back, not with the official sonar or the search and rescue team. I had to go back alone, equipped for deep technical diving, and I had to find out what that lake was concealing. Preparation took another agonizing 24 hours. I pulled my old dry suit, the heavy-duty model reserved for winter ice diving, out of storage. I calibrated a specialized low-frequency side-scan sonar designed to pierce dense layers of mud and sediment, hoping to map the exact topography of the lake bed near the drop-off point. My biggest logistical hurdle was the power source. I needed maximum luminescence underwater, without giving off a telltale glow on the surface. I rigged 4 high-powered LED floodlights onto a custom frame, running the cables back to a heavy marine battery, all loaded onto my small, unregistered aluminum dinghy, disguised crudely with a few fishing rods as an alibi. It was 3 in the morning when I put the dinghy into the water at the secluded northern access point, the same area where the official search had concluded its initial phase weeks ago. The air was frigid, the silence absolute. The only sound was the almost imperceptible lapping of the water against the hull, and the heavy rhythmic thud of my own heart, hammering against the neoprene of my undersuit. I reached the approximate location within 40 minutes, relying on GPS coordinates I'd secretly logged during the initial search. The water here was known to be over 200 feet deep, a black void even in the middle of the day. The process of gearing up was a study in heightened anxiety. Every zipper, every clip, every blast of compressed air filling the suit sounded deafening in the stillness. I checked the tanks, double 12-liter manifolds, rich nitrox mix. Enough time for a decompression stop if needed, but the plan was simple. descend, confirm the geology, and ascend rapidly. I strapped the geological hammer and sample bags to my thigh just in case. As I slipped backward into the frigid water, the shock was instant, despite the dry suit. It wasn't just the cold, it was the sudden oppressive weight of the darkness. Once submerged, I turned on the lights. The first 50 feet were standard, murky water, suspended glacial particulates, visibility maybe 10 feet. But as I passed the 60-foot mark, the water clarity suddenly and impossibly increased. It was like dropping through a ceiling of murk into an immense, silent, subterranean chamber filled with perfectly clear, highly pressurized liquid. My depth gauge ticked past 100 feet. The temperature gauge, however, began to deliver readings that made my blood run cold. Instead of steadily dropping towards the 4 degrees Celsius isothermal layer, it began to rise. Not dramatically, but unnervingly, hovering around 7, then 8 degrees. That was impossible for a glacial tarn fed by snowmelt and underground springs. It suggested a massive, hidden geothermal source, or something actively generating heat beneath the surface. I deployed the sonar unit, sending out the low-frequency pulses. The return was instant and perplexing. Instead of the typical chaotic return echo that signaled a soft, undulating mud bottom, the sonar reported an unnaturally smooth, almost reflective surface at 187 feet. It was too flat, too perfect. I continued the descent, equalizing pressure with desperate, methodical swallows. The final 15 feet were agonizingly slow. I controlled my buoyancy perfectly, maintaining a neutral position just above the predicted floor. And then I saw it. My floodlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the bottom not as the rolling grey silt I expected, but as an enormous, perfectly level plane of dark, polished material. It wasn't rock, it wasn't concrete. It looked like obsidian that had been melted, poured, and then cooled under immense pressure. It absorbed most of the light, giving the illusion of limitless depth, yet my gauges screamed 188 feet. This wasn't a natural formation, this was engineering. I gently landed my fins on the surface. There was no cloud of disturbed silt, no residual mud, just a slight metallic crunching sound under my weight. I knelt down and used a small, focused beam to examine the immediate area. This was the exact location where I had snagged the backpack weeks earlier. I remembered the slight depression, the way the line had jerked, and now I understood why the backpack was dry. It hadn't been resting on the waterlogged bed of Lake Serafina. It had been resting on a floor. I pulled out the geological hammer, expecting to strike bedrock or dense igneous material. Instead, the hammerhead rebounded with a high, sharp clank, the sound vibrating through the water and my bones. I struck again, harder, driving the sharp pick end into the surface. It didn't chip, didn't crack. It just scraped, leaving a streak of pale metallic residue on the black surface. The material was impossibly hard, non-porous, and seemingly manufactured. I began to crawl along the floor, pushing the light frame ahead of me, tracing the area. The flatness was relentless for maybe 30 feet in every direction I scanned. Then, the pattern broke. My light caught a discontinuity in the planar surface, a seam running horizontally across the floor. It was impossibly precise, a hairline fracture marking a perimeter. I followed the seam until it turned a perfect 90-degree corner. I was tracing the outline of an immense buried structure, a flawless rectangle submerged beneath the false bottom of the lake. My breathing accelerated, consuming the compressed air far too quickly. This wasn't just a backpack mystery. This was evidence of massive concealed construction, maybe military, maybe ancient, maybe something I couldn't even process. My hand brushed against a vertical protrusion near the corner of the seam. It was recessed, almost perfectly flush with the dark floor, but distinguishable by texture. I cleared the immediate area, scraping away the faint, crystalline grit that lay across the surface. What emerged was a plate, approximately 3 feet square, set perfectly into the floor. And in the center of the plate was a keyhole. It wasn't a standard tumbler lock mechanism. It was intricate, a complex series of nested hexagonal sockets, perfectly matching the angular grooves of the key I was carrying in my dry suit pouch, the key found inside Leo's dry backpack. The air in my mask seemed suddenly thin, suffocating. I gripped the geological hammer until my knuckles ached. This was the open loop, the physical convergence of the anomaly. The structure was here, Leo's backpack was here, and the key, his key, was designed to interface with this buried apparatus. I knew with a certainty that chilled me far more than the pressure-intensified water that I shouldn't proceed. Finding the structure was enough. Documenting it, rising to the surface, and bringing in the military or the geological survey was the only sane response. But the obsession, the sheer burning need to understand why Leo, a 6-year-old child, possessed the key to a massive underwater complex, overruled all rational thought. I couldn't leave without attempting to activate it. I had to know what was on the other side of that lock. My hands, protected by thick diving gloves, fumbled the small, dark key out of the pouch. The key felt cold, radiating the impossible density I had noted earlier. I held the light steady and approached the lock mechanism. My reflection stared back at me in the polished black surface of the plate, a nervous, wide-eyed ghost in an oversized helmet. I aligned the key. It was a perfect fit. The complex angles slotted together with an unnerving, almost magnetic precision. There was no scraping, no effort, just a seamless, quiet connection. I hesitated. The key was seated, waiting. Turning it meant committing to a course of action that might violate national security, geological stability, or worse. It meant entering the deep, dark heart of Leo's disappearance. My breath hitched. I placed my thumb and forefinger on the key, pressing gently. The moment I exerted the slightest turning pressure, the entire mechanism came silently alive. The key did not turn. Instead, the plate beneath the keyhole depressed inward by perhaps an inch, accompanied by a sudden, violent vibration that rattled my teeth and shook the thick glass of my helmet. I flinched, pulling my hand away instantly. The vibration didn't stop. It began to intensify, transforming from a high-frequency thrum into a deep, sustained resonance that bypassed my eardrums and burrowed directly into my inner ear. The light reflecting off the floor began to shimmer and distort. Then, the water itself began to move. It wasn't a current. It was an oscillation, a powerful rhythmic pulse radiating from the plate. The water temperature gauge, which had been creeping up slightly, suddenly spiked. 12 degrees. 15 degrees. The water was warming rapidly, creating visible distortion waves around my light beam. I looked frantically at the seam I had traced. Along the hairline perimeter of the submerged structure, the line widened, perhaps by a millimeter, glowing faintly with a sickly pale green light that defied description. It wasn't bioluminescence, it was structured, generated light coming from within the dark plate. The structure was opening. The sheer scale of the event overwhelmed my ability to think clearly. I had just initiated a seismic shift in the lakebed. I had to get out. Now. But before I could kick off the structure and begin my ascent, a sound, a terrible, low, grinding moan, erupted from the opening seam. It was the sound of colossal weight shifting against ancient hinges. The green light intensified, bathing the immediate area in a terrifying, ethereal glow. The pressure surrounding me momentarily felt wrong, uneven, as if the water column above was being displaced. Then, from the gap in the floor, something began to rise. I recoiled violently, kicking back, scrambling away from the source of the noise. My air consumption rate skyrocketed, driven by pure, unadulterated terror. I couldn't identify what was emerging through the green light. It was massive, metallic, and covered in the same reflective black material as the floor. It was articulated, segmented, rising slowly like the head of some ancient, mechanized leviathan disturbed from its slumber. I managed to stabilize my position 20 feet above the plate, gripping the side of my light frame for stability. The pressure surge had passed, but the temperature was still climbing, now reading 18 degrees Celsius, warm enough to be felt through the heavy insulation of the dry suit. What I saw was not a weapon, nor a door, nor a submerged vehicle. It was an object of geometry, a perfect hollow cylinder of enormous diameter, rising slowly from the lake floor, shedding the dense crystalline grit of the lake bed like dead skin. I remembered the drawing in Leo's backpack, the impossibly tall, hollow structure, depicted reaching towards the sky. The drawing wasn't of a building above ground. It was a depiction of a machine, a column, emerging from the depths. I looked down at the key still perfectly seated in the locking plate, the trigger for this massive ascent. The complex mechanism was now humming audibly, vibrating the water around it. There was no time for documentation or analysis. The sheer size of the emerging column meant that whatever lay inside was about to breach the surface of the lake, drawing attention that would swiftly supersede all my previous attempts at secrecy. I had activated something enormous, something hidden for perhaps millennia, using a 6-year-old child's key. And whatever it was coming up. I abandoned the light frame and the sonar, kicking hard toward the surface, leaving the impossible glow and the rising geometry of the machine behind me. I had descended looking for a lost child's resting place. I was ascending having woken the mountain beneath the water. I had turned the lock. The door was open. The question of what Leo was protecting and what he had found was now superseded by the horrifying realization of what I had just unleashed upon the world. The only thing dry at the bottom of the lake was not mud, but an ancient, dormant power source. I broke the surface, gasping for the cold night air, the terrible knowledge burning in my mind. The entire lake surface was calm, deceivingly still, but beneath the mirror-like blackness, the column was still rising. I have to get to that key, I thought desperately, as I frantically hauled myself back into the small aluminum boat. I have to see what is inside that column before anyone else sees it at all. I have to find out if Leo is somehow part of this terrible, deep secret. What did I just let out? And how do I turn it off? I need to get back, but I need real help, someone who understands impossible geometries and hidden architecture, someone who knows why this key exists and why it was entrusted to a missing boy. I'm going to need to tell the story now. I'm going to need you to understand. And I'm running out of time before the sun rises, before this thing breaches. Tell me what I missed. Tell me what Leo knew. I had reached the edge of what was real. That realization, cold and slick like the obsidian stones lining the lake's shore, was the true payload of fear, far heavier than the adrenaline surges of the initial search. The dry backpack, lying impossibly preserved 30 feet down in Lake Solstice, wasn't just a riddle, it was a boundary marker. It was a neon sign planted in the mud reading, "Beyond this point, the rules of physics do not apply." I spent the next 48 hours in a fog of mandated professional interaction and acute psychological isolation. I had officially reported the find, the backpack, the confirmation of the child's identity, but I had sanitized the key detail. I couldn't tell them it was dry. I simply couldn't. To admit that would be to admit either a failure of my own senses or the emergence of an impossible truth that would strip me of my badge, my credibility, and possibly my sanity. They were already mobilizing the next phase of the investigation, planning grid searches, bringing in scent dogs from outside the county, all based on the logical premise that if the pack was found there, the boy had drowned or had been pulled into a sinkhole. But I knew the truth was wet on the outside and arid on the inside, and that discrepancy burned in my stomach like a dose of caustic acid. I returned to the lake alone, under the oppressive weight of a midnight sky devoid of stars. I didn't take the patrol vehicle. I walked. I needed the physical exertion, the ache in my joints to anchor me to reality before I willingly dipped back into the impossible. I carried minimal gear, my high-powered underwater tactical light, my dive mask, and a small reinforced crowbar. A ridiculous weapon against an enemy I couldn't define, but a necessary comfort nonetheless. The air around Solstice Lake was different tonight. It wasn't just cold, it hummed. It held a density, a palpable pressure that felt like standing inside a giant, slow-pulsing subwoofer. The surface of the water, usually disturbed by nocturnal insects or the casual ripple of the breeze, was absolutely motionless, a sheet of polished black glass reflecting nothing but the void above. I walked the perimeter until I reached the spot, the cluster of submerged, lightning-blasted pines near the deepest drop-off. I remembered the exact placement of the rock cairn I had built during the initial descent, marking the precise location of the find. This time, I didn't enter the water with the measured caution of a rescue diver. I stepped off the bank with the desperate finality of a trespasser crossing a condemned threshold. The cold was shocking, paralyzing, but quickly faded beneath the rising tide of pure, obsessive focus. I descended quickly, following the beam of my lamp. The deeper I went, the less the water felt like water. It gained a viscous quality, transparent but heavy, muffling sound to a suffocating silence. Even the bubbles escaping my own lungs seemed to pop with less enthusiasm, dissolving into the gloom. 30 feet down. The rock cairn. I knelt beside it, sweeping the light. The backpack was gone. A surge of panic, visceral and hot, flared through me. Had the authorities found it and moved it? No, they hadn't retrieved the evidence yet. Had the current shifted it? Impossible, it was weighted down. Then I saw it wasn't shifted, it was moved. It was perhaps 10 feet further, positioned directly against the base of the largest, gnarliest stump of the dead pine. And the ground immediately surrounding it was not mud, but something else entirely. I swam closer, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced the pressure would shatter bone. I directed the light beam down, focusing it intensely on the lake bed. The ground was dry. Completely, utterly, flawlessly dry. It wasn't just the backpack, it was a perfect localized sphere of absent water. The dry patch wasn't small, maybe 8 feet in diameter, extending vertically from the lake bed upward. It was impossible to see the boundary of the sphere from above, as the water flowed seamlessly around it, but I could feel it. As I approached the invisible dome, the pressure change was violent, pushing against me like a physical wall of air, or perhaps anti-water. My gloved hand breached the boundary first. The sensation was immediate and profound. My hand went from being submerged in 38-degree fluid to being suspended in an atmosphere that felt oddly warm and sterile. It smelled faintly of ozone and old dust. It was breathing air, but air that was ancient, preserved. I forced my body across the threshold, pulling myself along the lip of the dome boundary. The sound of the lake instantly vanished. I was encased in a perfect, crystalline silence. The water surrounding this pocket didn't splash or ripple against the boundary. It behaved like thick oil flowing around an invisible glass container. I stood on the dry lake floor, inside a bubble of impossible reality. The backpack was resting there, now serving as a bizarre doormat. But what commanded my attention was what lay beyond it. The stump of the dead pine was not merely a stump, it was the entrance. The inside of the stump, which should have been rotting, waterlogged wood, was hollowed out and reinforced with something that looked like petrified root material, shining faintly with a metallic sheen. It was a doorway, a subterranean aperture leading downward, away from the light and the water. Hesitation was a luxury I couldn't afford. The cold fear had solidified into absolute resolve. I had to know. For Leo, for the parents, and perhaps most selfishly, for the fragile definition of reality I still clung to. I crouched and entered the aperture. The tunnel sloped steeply down. It was narrow, forcing me to crawl, dragging the tactical light ahead of me. The air here was even warmer, drier, pressing against my eardrums. The silence was intense, broken only by the rasp of my breathing and the sound of my gear scraping against the strange, smooth walls. I crawled for what felt like an hour, though it was likely only minutes. The sense of descending into the earth, moving further and further from the surface world, was overwhelming. My imagination conjured every terrifying subterranean horror, claustrophobia, collapse, creatures of the deep dark. But all of it paled in comparison to the single driving question: what force maintains this impossible space? Then, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern. I pushed out of the passage and scrambled onto solid rock ground. I stood up slowly, sweeping the powerful beam of the light across the interior. The cavern was enormous, cathedral-like, extending far beyond the reach of my lamp. It was acoustically dead, drinking up every vibration. The rock walls were veined with minerals that caught the light, sparkling in unsettling, precise geometric patterns. And in the center of the cavern there was a structure. It wasn't built, it was grown. A cluster of crystalline formations, pulsing with a low, internal emerald light, coalesced into a sort of alcove or grotto. It looked ancient, alien, and utterly profoundly wrong in the geological context of the mountain range. And within the grotto, I saw the boy. Leo. He was sitting cross-legged on a shelf of luminous quartz, wearing the same clothes he had been reported missing in, except they were immaculate, completely dry and strangely vibrant. He wasn't huddled in fear, he wasn't crying, he wasn't injured. He was staring at me. His face was pale, translucent almost, but his eyes were wide, clear and unnervingly placid. There was no joy, no terror, no relief at the sight of a rescuer, only deep, unsettling observation. "Leo," I whispered, the sound swallowed immediately by the air. I started walking toward him, my boots crunching on the crystalline floor. As I drew nearer, the emerald light intensified. I could see the boy clearly now. He looked younger than his age, perhaps preserved, but there was a stillness about him that defied the energy of a living child. I stopped 10 feet away. "Leo, it's okay. I'm Ranger Holt. I'm here to take you home." He didn't move. He didn't blink. His gaze was fixed, penetrating, and held an understanding that no 6-year-old should possess. Then I saw the other presence. It wasn't a monster or a creature in the traditional sense. It manifested not visually but conceptually, filling the space around the crystal grotto with a profound sense of scale and age. It was woven into the structure itself, into the crystalline matrices and the deep, humming resonance of the earth beneath us. I felt its presence enter my mind, not as a voice but as an instantaneous download of knowledge, vast and incomprehensible. "You have crossed the shadowed shore. It is not your place." The mental contact was overwhelming, threatening to fracture my consciousness. It was cold, patient, and utterly indifferent to my fear. The water is the veil. The child is quiet here. I tried to speak, but the air felt too thick, too heavy for sound. I pointed toward Leo, my hand trembling violently. "He needs to go back. His parents are waiting." The presence intensified, pressing down on my skull until I dropped to my knees, gasping. The light around Leo dimmed slightly, confirming the entity's control over the environment. "He does not need the noise. He does not need the wet." His anxiety was a signal. We answered. I understood now the dryness, the missing backpack, left as a beacon on the threshold. Leo hadn't simply run away. His specific state of mind, perhaps a unique frequency of fear or a profound loneliness, had somehow resonated with this latent ancient protector, this geological sentinel buried beneath the lake. It had opened a temporary passage, shielded by the anti-water dome, and drawn the child into the stillness. I looked at Leo again. He was unnervingly healthy, unscarred. He was being maintained, suspended, perhaps, outside of human time. He was protected, yes, but he was also gone. I fought the oppressive mental pressure, forcing out a ragged question. "What are you?" "We are the memory of the stone. We are the wardens of the quiet places. The wetness is impermanence. The dryness is eternity." I realized I couldn't fight it. The power was absolute, geological, and indifferent. If I tried to touch Leo, I felt a certainty that I would be stopped, perhaps not violently, but certainly permanently, folded into the stillness of the rock myself. The choice crystallized. I could attempt a rescue that would fail and likely result in my disappearance, lending credibility to the entity and terrifying the world. Or I could retreat, carry the secret, and give the parents the only narrative they could ever accept. I looked at Leo one last time. His eyes, fixed on mine, seemed to hold a flicker of recognition, but overlaid with a profound, terrifying peace. He was not unhappy. He was simply removed. I backed away slowly, bowing my head in a silent acknowledgement of defeat. I retreated, crawling back into the narrow passage, leaving the warmth and the strange light behind. As I climbed back through the threshold, breaching the anti-water dome and plunging back into the cold, dense lake water, the oppressive mental presence lifted, leaving behind a searing psychic imprint of impossibility. I ascended quickly, scrambling onto the muddy shore under the starless sky. I didn't look back. I didn't report the cavern. I reported the continued absence. I maintained the lie. I reported finding the empty backpack, confirming the boy's identity, but concluding that the extreme depth and the cold currents likely carried the body away, making recovery impossible. It was the only report that would close the case without opening a portal to madness. The parents grieved, eventually finding a grim solace in the finality of the tragedy. I left the Forest Service 6 weeks later, citing burnout and chronic stress. I couldn't stand the sight of the lake anymore, that flawless sheet of black glass that hid a dry, silent city beneath its waves. The nightmare of the dry backpack is not the mystery of how it was dry, but the terrible final certainty of why Leo is not dead. He is simply archived. He is safe, suspended in the mineral silence, preserved by a force that uses the deepest parts of our world to guard the boundaries of another. And I am the only one who knows that sometimes the greatest terror is finding the missing child, only to realize they have been claimed by something far older and far more powerful than the search itself, left perfectly dry at the bottom of the world's deepest, wettest secret. And I know with chilling certainty that the silent watcher beneath Lake Solstice waits patiently, watching the surface, waiting for the next signal of profound human desperation, ready to open the dry path once more. If you have ventured into places where the rules seem to bend, if you felt the oppressive, unnatural silence that marks a boundary, don't investigate. Turn around. Leave the mystery unsolved. Because some doors, once confirmed, can never be unseen. Share your experience below. The uncanny quiet, the places where water feels wrong, where the dry earth speaks. Tell me I'm not the only one who found a place where reality failed.